Okay, I think most people have joined us, but I just want to say hello and welcome to today's webinar. It's fantastic to see so many of you joining us from across the world, and I really want to take this opportunity to encourage you to get in contact and participate throughout today's webinar. So if you want to share your name, your current job, and where you're joining us from today, it would be great to hear from you. I will start us off. I'm Hazel and I am the course advisor for Educational Leadership in Practice here at the University of Manchester, and I'm based in Manchester. Throughout today's session, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for you to get involved. So you can share your thoughts throughout our panel discussion using the chat function, and you'll also be able to submit questions throughout the discussion using the Q&A function. I'm just going to give you a brief idea of what we are going to be talking about today. So we're going to start with some introductions, and then we're going to move on to our panel discussion on the topic of leadership in the round, whether it's collaborative and inclusive or conflicted and overwhelming. And then at the end of that, I'll be giving you a course overview for MA Leadership in Practice, and I will also be sharing my contact details if you would like to get in touch later today. So the International Day of Education is held on the 24th of January each year, and this was first held in 2019. It's been designated by the United Nations because, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, education is a human right, and quality education is the key to sustainable development. One of the key challenges and barriers to addressing a quality education has been identified as leadership, which brings us around really nicely onto today's topic. So, which is leadership in the round, collaborative and inclusive or conflicted and overwhelming. We're going to be focusing on the importance of leadership and looking at the benefits and challenges associated with collaborative leadership. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by a panel of experts to discuss this further, and I'm now going to hand over to them to introduce themselves.
Hello and welcome to all of you on this important day, International Day of Education. And may I extend our warm welcome from Manchester, where Steve and I are based, and from Chengdu, where Dan is also based today. My name is Bee Hughes and I'm a senior lecturer in Education, Leadership and Policy at the University of Manchester in the Manchester Institute of Education. And I'm heavily involved with teaching master's students, particularly on the Education Leadership in Practice blended master's course. And so I'm also very delighted to welcome Professor Steve Courtney, who also teaches on that programme, but is Professor of Sociology of Education Leadership here in Manchester. Steve, would you like to just introduce yourself and give us a short overview? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bee. Hello, everybody. Delighted to be here. As Bee says, I am Professor of Sociology of Education Leadership. I am also Research Director in the Manchester Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. Alongside that, I'm co-editor-in-chief of the journal Critical Studies in Education. And I also co-lead the MIE research group, Critical Education Leadership and Policy. I'm delighted to be here.
Welcome, Steve. And I'm also thrilled to welcome a very special colleague of ours, Dan Leng, who's an alumna of University of Manchester. She did her master's here. Dan, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Lin. I'm the 2024 graduate from the ELIT program, Educational Leadership in Practice, from the University of Manchester. It is a great pleasure to be here and reconnect with Stephen and Bing. Both of them are actually my teachers during my 2 years study. I've been working in international education for more than 13 years, and my leadership experience involves in leading student holistic development program and also human resource management. And currently I'm with Malvern College of Chengdu and responsible for the parent holistic learning and connect of the school. Thank you.
Marvellous, Dan. I think we'll get into a bit of that in terms of our leadership practices a little later, but thank you for your introductions.
Just before we get started as well, Paul Armstrong, our course director as well, is also in the audience today, and he's just extended his welcome to everyone. So I just wanted to introduce him as well.
Welcome, Paul. Lovely to hear that you're on the call. Wonderful. Let's get into the discussions then, colleagues, around leadership and discussing leadership in terms of whether it is collaborative or inclusive or conflicted and overwhelming. I'm not sure there's answers to all of those things, but let's try and be a bit more provocative, because I think our title for this webinar is indeed a little provocative in relation to leadership. So Steve, let me start with you, if I may. You've written extensively about leadership, both conceptually and theoretically, in thinking about leadership from the perspective, for example, of micropolitics of system leadership, in particular contexts, particularly in England. You've also written about issues over retention of school leaders, and you have an interest, obviously, in education policy. You've also, I know, written with colleagues on system leadership in China as well, from the point of view of educational collectives. You've written about teacher resistance, and you've also analysed notions of charisma in leadership. So your expertise is obviously very important and helpful for this webinar. You've also looked at troubling contemporary notions about school leaders and their retention. So perhaps for the opening question, can you tell us what you understand to be this notion, this framing, collaborative leadership?
Thanks, Bee. Well, it turns out that it's incredibly hard to define. I'm going to take a step back, if I can, and look at education leadership more broadly, first of all. Where you are looking from largely determines what the answer is to this question. And it turns out that people who study educational leadership tend to be located in one of two broad camps. And we can tell you all about the definition of those camps when you sign up for the Masters in Education Leadership in Practice. But briefly, they can be described as functionalist and critical. And they have very different ideas about what educational leadership is, and hence what it means to collaborate within those two paradigms. So if you're writing from a functionalist perspective, then you tend to see educational leadership as being largely about traits and behaviors. And so it's what a leader as an individual is and what that leader as an individual does. And so leadership becomes a suite of skills that are learnable and teachable. And it's interesting how leadership as a concept in functionalism has become separated from management. And so management is very much a kind of conceptual dumping ground for all the bits of leadership that are unappealing or unglamorous. So management becomes about organizational functioning, making sure that you've hired the right people to do the job, that the resources are in place, that the spreadsheets are there, and so on. Whereas leadership becomes much more glamorous and associated with mechanisms such as persuasion and influence. And you have a vision if you're a leader, whereas if you're a manager, you have a spreadsheet. Now, if you're a critical researcher, and I must say that this division between functionalist and critical tends to be largely about the research base. If you are working in a school or in an education institution, you're likely functionalist, just because that's the environment that you're enculturated within. But critical researchers tend to see leadership more as a function of power relations and structures. So leadership becomes something more relational, and it's probably inseparable from management in practice. The people making the spreadsheet still can't just tell people what to do. They still need to persuade people. There's no such thing as 100% authority. And so that debate actually between power and authority is very interesting and important in critical debates about educational leadership. The label of leadership creates identities or even characters. And so when people become leaders, they step into a role which gives them aspects of their identity. And so in a way, that prefigures whoever they were before. They kind of become someone new when they take on that role. But equally, there's a strong strand of thinking in critical educational leadership research that says that leadership doesn't even exist as a concept, because you can always explain it away by using other words like influence or organizational obligation. And it almost always has to be accompanied by a different word to give it a specific meaning, like transformational leadership, distributed leadership, system leadership, instructional leadership. Without those adjectives, the word doesn't really mean much on its own. And so that's an important debate. And so, I mean, you've said that I've written about charisma, and I have, but I would just like to say in finishing there that charisma is not well understood. And it's understood differently by those two camps, very, very differently. Charisma is likely to be an important reason why people get a job as an educational leader, but it does not mean that you'll be able to do it well.
Or sustain it. I think charisma certainly is variable in its manifestation. Thank you, Steve, for that very helpful and useful theoretical foundation of leadership. And it's kind of almost a contested term. I do sense, as a former head teacher myself and a school leader, that I was very functionalist when I was based in schools, exactly as you said. And then with my work within the university now, one's attitudes and responses and ontological understandings change to that of perhaps more critical engagement with the literatures and therefore with practice. Talking of practice, Dan, let's come to you then. You are a school leader of 13 years in an international context in China, in Chengdu. Can you just tell us about some of your understandings through your study of leadership, how that has those understandings helped you support your role to think about leadership in practice?
I just quite resonate with what Stephen, Professor Courtney has mentioned. Like before I learned this, the course, I joined the program. I with an intention that I'm trying to come here and adopt a strategy, adopt leadership skills that I could directly apply to my professional practice, like in my educational setting in the school. However, it proves I'm wrong, because after the study, I just feel, it repositioned my identity, like Professor Courtney mentioned, and I repositioned my role from a manager, before. What I do is just implement the policy, what has been decided from the senior management team. And my role is just to make sure everyone follow the job description and follow what has been decided, the policy, rules and disciplines. But now I just feel, I reflect what I used to be, and I feel like this is not what I want it to be. And I have a brand new insight on leader, and I am striving to be a brand new identity, like using my capacity to create more connection with teachers, with leaders, and with the parents. Just trying to build more collegiality and collaboration, giving support from one each other. And before I pay less attention about that. And the other thing that changes my mindset is I understand leadership and the leading practice very differently from before, because there is no best practice and no best leadership module that we could adopt. Because I think there's no standardized best practice for us to adopt from one course. And because the reason is because we work with people from different cultural background, from different histories, and with different life experience. So my suggestion for you and for also myself is, let's step back and getting to know the people around us and getting to know the cultural background in our educational setting as well, get to know the micro and macro political environment around us. So this is my suggestion. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful and useful and insightful. And you mentioned there that notion of collaboration, and Steve mentioned these adjectives that often are used in the literatures, transformational, distributed. And I'm going to ask Steve, put him on the spot a little bit. There are clearly tensions with these descriptions. Can you just highlight some of the tensions that you might share with us about notions of collaborative leadership?
Well, most education systems operating under marketized conditions have a default model of heroic, transformational, and corporatized leadership built into them, which are by their very nature not particularly collaborative. There's structural evidence for this argument. So, for example, public school governance is increasingly intended to resemble that of corporations. with their boards, their trustees and CEOs. Operationally, of course, the CEO is the major figure, and the CEO role is notoriously uncollaborative by design. Private international schools have this governance structure as a normal consequence of their location in the private sector. So whatever structures might lie beneath the CEO role, arguably the mere fact of having a CEO-based design produces CEO-oriented thinking about leadership throughout the organization. So that's to say that principals have lots of power, and any power held by other staff members is delegated to them from higher up the organizational hierarchy. Now, leading education institutions is very challenging. So in practice, the heroic model often doesn't work very well. And this may be because of role overload within a school, or perhaps because formal collaborations and mergers between schools have become prioritized in national policy. So the CEO or the executive principal may need help to get things done, or may be required to collaborate across multiple institutions. So that's where collaborative models come into play. There are several theoretical explanations of the sorts of collaborative model that might be found. And so you can read about distributed leadership, and that has a sub-form that's come into play, teacher leadership. There's also system leadership. But since the overarching framing for this collaboration remains CEO or heroic principle oriented, it's easy for these collaborations to be unequal and for true power to remain with the top role holder, which means that distributed and teacher leadership on the ground may become simply delegation with sprinkles of leadership glamour. I mean, after all, when you think about it, how can leadership truly be distributed? What exactly are you distributing? System leadership, in this view, simply becomes the required managerial response to privatized depoliticization comprising mergers and acquisitions. All of these are they're forms of management, but we need to call them leadership to obtain professional buy-in. So none of this is to say that truly collaborative leadership does not exist. And I'm sure we'll hear examples today. However, claims about collaborative leadership require researchers, including master students, to ask themselves challenging questions, such as, if I'm at the top of this organization, what's the basis for my choosing this particular person to undertake specific tasks on my behalf? To what extent do they have freedom to take a direction with which I disagree? If I'm not in the top job and I'm being asked to take on a role called leadership, what are the likely consequences if I decline? What new accountability regimes will I become subject to? Why will people do what I ask? Is it because of my powers of persuasion, or is it because of the authority of my new position? And to what extent can I influence the local policy direction? So the answers to these questions reveal whether collaborative leadership is happening within a collaborative culture or within an individualized, high-stakes environment where it's more likely to be characterizable as functional delegation.
Well, that's very interesting and absolutely has resonance certainly with my work, but also with my experiences as a school leader, in that you're right, the CEO-ness of the system, particularly in the UK, in England, the notion of collaboration at the top, as at CEO level or executive head level or senior principal level is I think you're right, problematic. I think it's less evidenced perhaps. Notions of networking are slightly different, and Dan, I'm going to come on to you in a moment about that, because you've mentioned in your work networking, the importance of it. But in terms of collaboration, I think the very best forms of collaboration often happen at the mid-range or middle management level of institutions, educational institutions, where if the head's brave enough and courageous enough, without such accountability and performativity surrounding them, they give some autonomy towards an individual whom they recognise to be. And all the problems that all the questions that Steve's raised in this discussion are still, applicable. But certainly, in my practical experience, the best opportunities were those that were instigated by individuals probably at middle management level and were given quite a lot of influence to conduct the project perhaps in a way that didn't have too many ties or constraints to it, and therefore the trust was given or bestowed upon this individual to work collaboratively with interdisciplinary or interdepartmental teams. And I think perhaps that was the best experiences. The other experience of those who, of the individuals who are given that power, as Steve said, delegated perhaps in the notions of distributed leadership, and then are very controlling of everything that happens, and that can be problematic for other people. Dan, you also have talked about collaboration and also in the sense of networking, a slightly different but important part of our work as educators and leaders. But you mentioned the fact that you've developed and engaged with other fellow professionals, particularly through your master's study, but not necessarily. Can you just tell us briefly how this has supported your development as a leader, and how did these networks really work for you?
I actually have two examples I want to share. One is that during the study, during the 2-year study, as the HR manager, I'm responsible for creating and implementing the policy on teacher performance appraisal, and that's my main task. And I never interrogated its legitimation. And I just carry out the job and promoting the value of the performance appraisal among the teachers through meetings, and then it turned out to be a very negative outcome, and it leads a lot of conflicts between the leaders and teachers, and also leading into some excellent teachers turnover, to be honest. And this kind of a performance appraisal in my work area is closely related to we measure the teachers' workloads, linking the teacher's performance with the students' academic achievements, like their grade and outcome. And also even parent satisfaction rate via the surveys has been closely linked to their performance evaluation. And worstly, we also link the tutors, if a tutor's performance with the student loss rate. It happens not only to my school before, and also to some other school as far as I know. But before, I just feel this is the right thing. This is as my position, middle leaders implement what has been decided. There must be a reason. And when I started the course, it provoked me to think, where does this kind of performance appraisal come from? And why it leads a limited achievements achieved, or it goes very bad way, that direction, and why teachers are so resistant against it. So all of these questions that occur to me, so I choose this kind of experience as my and do some researches and interviews. Then I figure out that all of this kind of a performance appraisal is the thing coming from the business sector. It is used as a business management, not the school, education leadership. So the aim of it is to achieve the effectiveness and the efficiency of the organization or institution. When we implement in the school settings, like in my school, there's a value conflict. And that's why I figure out why teachers are resistant to it. Besides that, and I also figure out, the whole policy process, like from the policy construction, how this decision be made, and then we promote it, and the teacher are taking action to it as the policy practitioner. And there is an implementation gap. All this process has been very from the top down directive without communication or negotiation with the middle leaders, with the teachers. And this is another problem I figure out. And, all of this kind of process leads to an performative culture, and it is very detrimental. So that's my also conclusion in the study. And also I figure out what changes we could make on that. Then I also, from the literature review, from my small scale study, teachers' performance appraisal could be linked to their professional development, and that can be, contribute to their well-being, teachers' well-being. And for example, I give some suggestion to the senior leaders. We can transform the summative evaluation to more a formative ones, so that we really keen on the teachers' teaching and learning growth. With the support of the senior leaders, that's the key, increase the communication, provide them with resources, and that should be the key of the performance policy. And also we should turn to intrinsic motivation instead of the external motivation from the policy, because the good ones, according to the policy, could be awarded with bonus, and the poor ones could be punished. And so this is not right. And for the policy process, maybe we can invite some more middle leaders participate in the policy process during the policy formation at the beginning. So we give them more freedom, more autonomy, so that could cause less conflict. So I think this is a good example of how the whole process, as my position, I can see the changes both for myself and for the school side.
That's so helpful, and such great experience, practical experience you've had, and describing it so eloquently there, Dan. And actually, what's reassuring to Steve and I as researchers in academia is the fact that the theorizations that you've started to acquire and think about are now you're putting into practice in some profound way, which is very reassuring, I think, for Steve and I particularly. I think in terms of the conflicts and overwhelming nature of leadership, if we touch on that briefly, I know we haven't got a great deal of time left. I think as, again, an ex-head teacher, I think I felt overwhelmed with the performativity agenda, certainly the inspection regimes that were, deciding on compliance and the temperature of hot water and all this sort of stuff that almost made us feel totally inadequate as a school. But I think more importantly, in terms of from leaders feeling overwhelmed, obviously workload issues are still very, very significant in our work as professionals. And the research will tell us that. And I'm sure Steve will share some of his research that he's undertaken quite recently about head teacher retention. But I think the workload issue is huge. I think reduction of resources for schools, for school leaders, trying to manage those resources to ensure quality of education and learning despite reduction in resources is highly significant and challenging. And I think the other thing that often overwhelms senior colleagues in schools or educational settings is the challenges that we face in supporting and dealing with young people and colleagues and ourselves, mental health issues, and keeping that in check. And they are those sorts of challenges, if you like, beyond the classroom, can be almost overwhelming for people leading schools and education institutions. So I think that's still a lot of work has been done at that in the research, certainly post-COVID, but certainly we need to think about that as researchers, but also as practitioners. So Steve, let's just perhaps finish with a little comment about, or a comment in relation to your research on head teachers, because I know you, with some colleagues from Manchester, have been working with and interviewing, I think, some head teachers, and the fact that they are leaving the profession for profound and important reasons. Would you like to talk us through your findings of that research and exactly, who you perhaps interviewed? It'd be interesting to know a little bit more about that research.
Thank you. Yes, this is research that I've undertaken with Dr. Amanda McKay and Dr. Joanne Doherty. Now, we were investigating reasons why head teachers, principals leave the profession. And so that means that we were talking to those head teachers who felt that their experience of leaving the profession was so important that they wanted to respond to our call for participants. So in that sense, we're talking to people who had amongst the worst of experiences. But nonetheless, the fact that these have not yet found their way into the literature and yet were so devastating tells us a lot about what life can be like at that end of a career. And some of the stories that we heard were truly devastating. We heard stories from head teachers who had been crushed by the system, by their experiences, who felt that they had been turned on and betrayed by a system that should be supporting them. And so, for example, a large prompt for things going wrong is the school's inspection system in England, Ofsted. And a bad school inspection can often trigger principal departure. And so what we saw time and time again was examples of bad Ofsted inspection, or even just Ofsted inspections that shouldn't have been bad, given the actual state of the school, but which went bad for reasons that just seemed unfair and arbitrary. And head teachers are positioned as these, I'm top of the organization, I have all this power, but often in this new landscape in England, they're not at the top. There is a multi-academy trust CEO, or there may be, above them. And so the head teacher is one of a number working underneath the CEO, and they are expendable. So if getting rid of the head teacher is a way to save the whole multi-academy trust, then they will be got rid of. And the judgment about whether a head teacher is being supported can change in 24 hours during an inspection. We have seen a trend towards head teachers becoming younger over the last 20 years or so. And so we're finding people who normally would have been at the top of their career as a head teacher later in life, finding themselves jettisoned from the profession at a time when they need to find something else to do in life, actually, and they're still in their 30s. And what do? Some of them are so devastated by their experiences that they cannot stay in education, let alone just lick their wounds for a year or two and then go back into another headship role. One of them became a beautician, just doesn't want anything to do with education at all. Really tragic. So yes, we're still writing up the findings of that research. So that'll be in publications soon.
Excellent, Steve. Thank you for that. And how, as you say, it's profoundly disturbing, is it not, that our professional colleagues who we speak to very painfully unpick their experiences of being rejected or fired, as you say, and that needs certainly more research, and I'm sure your research is very timely with your colleagues, so thank you for that insight. I know we're coming to the end of it. Hazel, I guess we got a question I think we probably have on distributed leadership.
We have got a question. Are you able to see it, or would you like me to read it?
If you read it, then Steve and I and Dan can listen to it, and maybe I'll respond first, and then Steve and Dan can jump in if necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is from one of our attendees saying, I think collaborative leadership or distributed leadership is very ideal. However, I've heard that it can lead to delays in decision making and unclear accountability. How should I approach these issues? Additionally, under what circumstances do the challenges of these approaches tend to arise?
Great question, and thank you so much. So thoughtful. I'll kick off briefly and then I'll hand over to Steve and Dan. I think you're right. Collaborative leadership and distributed leadership are interesting descriptors, and we can unpick them and critique them, but perhaps not now. As Steve mentioned in his opening introduction, distributed leadership can be deemed to be, delegation, just management. And so in my experience, that often was the case. And so the point of it being an ideal is probably quite an accurate description. Delays leading to distributing decision making. In the day it was called contrived collegiality, if I remember rightly. It's all a bit contrived. I remember trying to discuss with governors and so on about trying to change the school logo. And never do that with more than 3 people, because trying to get to a decision, and in big decisions in the university we are experiencing, take time, and so distributing and having these discussion points to make a decision, I think, is problematic. I think gleaning information and ideas, as we do as researchers, social science researchers, in terms of interviewing and qualitative data, does help inform for us to come up with inferences and perhaps some form of conclusive evidence. But I think distributed leadership within a school situation, in any institution, can be problematic. Now, Steve will probably have a rant now, so I'm going to hand over to Steve about that. But I get that it's problematic as a leadership concept and practice. Steve.
Thanks, Bee. If your primary concern was the speed of leadership decision making, it's not clear to me why you would be distributing leadership, whose goals are surely more concerned with collaboration, with sharing, with bringing other people in. And so if you primarily want to reach decisions quickly, then either you wouldn't distribute leadership, or you would be honest and say that what you're actually doing is delegating. Now, delegating can lead to more speedy decision making on the grounds that if you're in a reasonably large organization, one person can't effect change throughout that whole organization in a quick way. And so that's more about enactment, really. And so you might therefore speedily bring other people in order to have decisions enacted more speedily. But that's different from making decisions. There is no quicker way to make a decision organizationally than to have one person do it. So I think it's about deciding which is more important to you organizationally.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at our new Vice Chancellor at the university, there's lots of consultations and working with people and students and understanding how the university works. But I'm not sure how many constructive decisions have been made in that sense. There's a lot of consultancy going on and consulting other people and the stakeholders, but there's no, as far as I can see, that evolution of the leadership right now, there's not any huge big decisions that need to be made. And I think as a leader, often you have to make decisions on your own and take the responsibility for doing that, because, you know, as a questioner said, you know, it can just delay stuff and it's not productive. Dan, I think we're going to move on because we're running out of time. Hazel, are we okay? Or I think, how are we for time? You're the timekeeper.
Got about 3 minutes before I need to take
Okay, so okay, that's great. Thank you. So Dan, any other final comments from you, just briefly about you know, leadership or collaborative leadership or any of the kind of themes we've touched on today from your own practical experience?
Because this is we also aim for enrollment. You know, people who join here, the educators. If you are really think about joining the program, I do think because you're gonna this is a part-time and it's a blended learning. You're gonna spend a lot of time, you know, on this study. Just get prepared and willing to spend the time and contribute the time. So you will gain, you know, what you expect. Yeah.
We have one other question, I think, Hazel. Shall I read it? Because I've got it open now. I've figured out how to do this. So
Yeah, be happy to.
How does a collaborative approach to education leadership promote shared decision making and responsibility? Over to you, Steve. You knew I was going to do that.
In 2 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
It depends on the structures that you do it through. If you really want shared decision making, then you've got to take account of the accountability regime within which you're operating. And so if it's only your head on the line as the top person in charge for whatever is produced, then you are going to take a very different approach than if that strong accountability does not exist. But if there is genuinely no high stakes accountability for the decisions, then you can afford to take your time. You can afford to consult widely. You can afford to get a range of views. You can't promise to take everyone's views into account into the final policy going forward. But if people feel listened to, at least, and they understand the reasons why their ideas didn't make it through into the final cut, then they're more likely to accept it.
Yeah, and there's actually some nascent research on leaderless teams now, I suggest, perhaps not within the educational field, but possibly so. But that's probably for another day. Leaderless teams, leaderless schools. Here we go. I don't know what that really means. Hazel, over to you. Thank you.
No, that's no problem at all. And I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you as our panel and for those questions that were submitted as well. It's great to hear from you. So I know we've just had a question coming up a little bit about the course. And so I'm just going to share my screen and I'm going to just give you a little bit of a course overview and a little bit more information about MA Leadership in Practice. So this is a course that runs from our 5 centres internationally. We've got Manchester, Dubai, Hong Kong, Shanghai and Singapore. And I know we've got representatives from across the world today who are part of all of those centres. So thank you so much for joining us. And this is a part-time blended online course. So what that means is the majority of your learning is going to take place online. And then there are 2 conferences or workshops, depending on how you want to phrase it, which are held face-to-face, either here in Manchester or at our international centres. And that really depends on where you're closest to geographically. There's approximately 15 to 20 hours of study per week. And one thing that I know is hugely appreciated by our students is that it's 100% coursework based. So there's no exams, it's a chance for you to work through learning materials on each unit in your own time. And the course duration in total is over 24 months. So when we look at the individual units, we've got models of educational leadership, engaging with research and educational leadership, leading educational change, education policy and leadership, and educational leadership as a social practice. Those 5 units are all the mandatory units that you will have to study as part of the MA. And then you can top that up with an additional optional unit, which is usually either digital technologies and educational leadership or the leadership of international schools. And that forms the total number of taught units as part of the Masters before you go on to an independent supervised study or project, looking at the research skills and applying that research to professional practice and a project-based inquiry. So when you're studying these, you learn 1 unit at a time, and all of your learning materials are released through our virtual learning environment as well. And that is all designed to help you to manage your workload and work at your own pace. If you do have more questions about this, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just share some further details about this into the chat as well, just so you've got links to where there's further course information. And I'm just going to very, very briefly move on to the entry requirements. So if you are interested in studying this course, we do have entry requirements of a good honours degree with a minimum of a 2-1 or the overseas equivalent. And if you have an initial teaching qualification or at least 1 year's teaching experience, that is also desirable. And applicants who've got a 2-2 or the overseas equivalent in their degree can also be considered if they have at least 3 years of teaching experience. And if English isn't your first language, then we will just have to ask for some evidence of proficiency of that. It doesn't need to be a barrier to you applying for the course, and our admissions team can support you in gaining an English test if you do need one. But we're looking at English language to the equivalent of an IELTS of 6.5 overall, with no less than 6.5 in writing and no other subsection below 6 or the equivalent. And all of that is available to apply online. So you're available to apply for the course online, and applications are open now. What I'm going to do is, I can see we've got some requests from people that they may want to talk about the course in more detail. So what I'm going to do is I am going to share a poll for you just to indicate if you've got further questions and you do want to follow up with a member of the team. And what we'll do is we'll follow that up after the webinar, because I am aware now that we are beginning to run out of time. But I also just want to also just say to everyone, just thank you for attending, to our panel for taking their time out of their busy days today, to Dan Lang joining us from a completely different time zone, and to Bee and Steve as well. And thank you as well to everyone who's attended. Yeah, so just want to just give you all a chance to fill in if you've got any further questions. But other than that, I think that brings us to the conclusion of today's session.
Thank you, Hazel. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just filling in an answer.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. That was enormous fun.